Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are getting into something that is, it's incredibly dense, but just fascinating. We're looking at excerpts from the 1812 Fifth Report from the Select Committee of the House of Commons on the Affairs of the East India Company.
Which is quite a mouthful, I know.
Yeah, it really is. But our mission today isn't just to recite dusty colonial history. We want to unpack a story that is full of massive egos, literal armed government standoffs, and, the very real dangerous consequences of applying armchair philosophy to complex, real-world problems.
Right, because the stakes here were incredibly high.
Exactly. So to hook you right away, I want you to imagine a standoff, but not like a standard political debate. We're talking about a literal armed confrontation between two branches of the exact same government.
A total breakdown of
So complete anarchy. On one side, you've got the Supreme Court, and they've just sent a posse of, I think, 60 to 70 armed men, mostly sailors, to march on a local ruler's estate. And they don't just, politely knock with a warrant.
No, not at all.
They raid the place with muskets and bayonets. They outrage the sanctity of the family idol. They break into the women's quarters, the zenana, and they seize this local ruler. And how does the executive branch respond to this?
Well, they don't exactly call it a town hall meeting.
Right. The governor general orders military troops to intercept the posse, surround them, and arrest the court's sheriff. So, we are diving into this to find out how a government goes to war with itself, and really what happens when armchair philosophers are handed the keys to a kingdom of 10 million people. So how did we even get to the point of armed sailors raiding an estate?
So it really starts with a fundamental misunderstanding of what the East India Company actually was at that point, back in 1779. I mean, initially they were built to be just a trading corporation.
Just buying spices and silk, right?
Exactly. Spices, silk, tea. But through this chaotic series of military conquests and treaties, this corporate entity suddenly found itself acting as the de facto government of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And the specific spark for this armed standoff was something called the Kassijura cause.
The Kassijura cause. Okay.
Right. So a man named Kasana Babu lent a very large sum of money to the Raja of Kassijura. And when the Raja didn't pay it back, well, Kasana Babu went to the Supreme Court in Calcutta to sue him.
Which, that sounds like a standard debt collection lawsuit. It seems like quite a leap to go from a civil lawsuit to deploying armed sailors and military intercepts.
It is a massive leap.
Yeah.
But the leap happened because of this huge dispute over jurisdiction. The Supreme Court, they operated entirely under English law. And the judges decided that the Raja, because he was involved in collecting land revenues for the local government, was basically an employee of the East India Company.
Oh, I see. So that made him subject to the court's authority in their eyes.
Precisely. But the Governor General, Warren Hastings, alongside his counsel, they looked at that ruling and realized the court was about to completely dismantle their entire revenue system. So Hastings issues this public notification to all the local landholders.
Basically telling them what?
Basically saying, if you haven't voluntarily submitted to the Supreme Court, ignore their process. They have absolutely no power over you.
Wow. So Hastings is openly telling the citizens to defy the highest court in the land. Think about what that would look like today.
It would be unimaginable.
Yeah, imagine if the mayor of a major city today deployed the National Guard to surround and capture a team of FBI agents simply because they disagreed on who had jurisdiction over a tax dispute. It's just structural anarchy.
It really is. And the Raja, well, he took Hastings' notification to heart. He literally drove away the sheriff when he first came to arrest him. And that humiliation is what prompted the Supreme Court to resort to extreme measures, sending that armed mob of sailors to sack the estate.
And Hastings wasn't bluffing either.
No. Hastings, sticking to his word, sent Colonel Amity and his troops to intercept the sheriff's posse on their way back to Calcutta and literally strip them of their captive.
That is just a government literally taking itself hostage. I'm struggling to see how you even begin to patch a system that broken, especially when egos of that magnitude are involved.
Well, Hastings engineered a fix that was highly effective in practice, but structurally it was highly controversial. He recognized that this constant friction between the revenue officers and the judicial officers would tear the entire colony apart.
So what was his workaround?
His solution was to revive this old, dormant appellate court called the Sadar Diwani Adalat. And then he appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Sir Elijah Impey, to be the head of this new appeals court.
Wait, let me stop you there.
Sure.
He takes the exact judge who is currently trying to arrest his revenue collectors, creates a brand new position, and just hands it to him. I'm assuming this came with a paycheck.
Oh, it came with a very hefty salary, 5,000 Sikh rupees a month, eventually attached to the role.
Okay, from where I'm sitting, that is the textbook definition of a bribe. You have a judge causing you massive logistical problems, so you just invent a highly paid position to buy his loyalty.
And his political enemies back in England framed it exactly that way. Later historians, specifically James Mill and Thomas Babington Macaulay, they absolutely savaged Hastings and Impey for this move.
Macaulay is pretty famous for his dramatic writing, right?
Oh, yeah. Macaulay knew exactly how to write a dramatic, best-selling history for a Victorian audience. He actually went so far as to compare Impey to the infamous, bloodthirsty English judge Jeffreys.
Ouch.
Yeah, Macaulay suggested no judge had dishonored the ermines since Jeffreys drank himself to death in the Tower of London.
Jeez. When you have historians of Macaulay's caliber writing that into the permanent record, it's hard to see Impey as anything other than a corrupt opportunist.
Right, but the problem is that the 1812 report, relying on the actual source documents from the time, it vindicates Impey. It shows how distorted that narrative became over time.
So he wasn't just pocketing the cash.
No, Impey didn't just take the money and look the other way. He actually accepted the office initially without the salary. Though, to be fair, he did write to his brother that he didn't suppose his trouble would go entirely uncompensated.
Naturally.
But more importantly, between October 1780 and July 1781, Impey worked tirelessly. In just 8 months, he compiled a massive, comprehensive code of regulations for the provincial courts that they desperately needed.
Oh, wow. So the whole narrative of the lazy bribe judge doesn't really hold up if he's actually grinding out a comprehensive legal code in less than a year.
Exactly. The sources actually praise his high sense of duty. The real underlying crisis here wasn't some corrupt backroom deal. The crisis was a terrifying, almost comical lack of human resources.
How bad are we talking?
To understand the scale, consider a quote in the sources from George Bogle, a commissioner of lawsuits at the time. The provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa contained roughly 10 million inhabitants.
Okay, 10 million.
Right. And the company had barely 20 or 30 qualified Englishmen available to administer justice over those 10 million people.
Wait, really? 20 or 30 people? For 10 million inhabitants. That isn't just a staffing shortage. That is a catastrophic corporate scaling failure.
It really is.
It's like a regional tech startup suddenly being told they have to moderate the entire global internet with a team of 20 interns. Of course the system was cracking.
Yeah, the total number of Englishmen employed in the entire civil government was barely 200 or 300, and most of them were busy collecting taxes or managing the actual trade business.
So everyone is just stretched completely thin.
Totally. Hastings knew that creating a functional appeals system overseen by the single most qualified legal mind in the region wasn't corruption. It was a matter of basic administrative survival.
Okay, wait. Earlier you said the Raja of Kasajura was targeting because he was involved in collecting land revenues. That means the guy the Supreme Court just sent armed sailors to arrest was essentially the keeper of the local purse. And that kind of reveals the real disease this government was suffering from, doesn't it? I mean, they were fighting over jurisdiction because they didn't actually know who owned the land they were trying to tax.
That is the foundational crisis right there. The East India Company was trying to extract revenue from a massively complex, ancient system that they just didn't fully comprehend.
Which is a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And this leads to a bitter, decade-long rivalry between Warren Hastings, who was a pragmatist deeply familiar with Indian customs, and his political nemesis, a man named Philip Francis.
Philip Francis. Now he sounds like the classic armchair philosopher, the kind of guy who reads a few books and suddenly thinks he can solve centuries-old geopolitical issues.
Francis is the absolute epitome of that archetype.
Yeah.
Hastings had been in India for years and really understood its intricate native customs of land revenue and tenure.
Well, Francis was just fresh off the boat.
Exactly. Francis arrived straight from Europe with his head full of theories. He was deeply influenced by the fashionable French doctrinaire authors of the time who preached pure, abstract economic theory.
So he's bringing French theory to an Indian reality.
Right. Francis approached the entire landscape of India through a single, old, European feudal maxim. Nulle terre sans seigneur, meaning there is no land without a lord.
So he's looking at a completely different continent with its own rich, complex history and just trying to force it into a European mold.
Yep. He looked at the local zamindars, who were essentially native agents involved in land management and tax collection, and he decided, based entirely on his French economic theories, that these men must be the absolute proprietors of the soil.
He literally just cast them in an English play.
Exactly. He saw them exactly like English squires or nobility. He wanted the government to declare these zamindars the absolute owners, fix their tax rate forever in a permanent settlement, and just walk away.
I mean, this is a classic map-territory relation error. He is mistaking his theoretical map of how the world should work for the actual messy territory he's standing on.
That's exactly what's happening.
Francis sounds like an executive who parachutes into a newly acquired company, completely ignores the actual engineers building the product, and forces everyone to use a management framework he read about in an airport business book.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. Hastings, on the other hand, argued that Francis's view was hopelessly a contradiction with the facts of history. Under the Mughal Empire, which preceded the British, the zamindars were not absolute owners.
They were just administrators, right?
Right. They were state-appointed tax collectors. They had certain hereditary rights to collect revenue, sure. But the ultimate owner of the land was the state. Furthermore, the actual cultivators, the ryots, had long-standing customary rights of occupancy.
Meaning they couldn't just be kicked off the land.
Exactly. They couldn't just be evicted at the whim of a landlord.
So Hastings is basically trying to explain that you can't just wave a legislative magic wand and declare local tax collectors to be English lords without destroying the entire social fabric beneath them.
Yes. Hastings insisted that before they could even discuss settling on any permanent revenue system, the government needed to do a hustabud.
A hustabud. Let's break that down for the listener. What does that actually look like in practice?
So a hustabud is a detailed, on-the-ground valuation of the lands. It means sending agents out into the field to measure the property, record what crops are being grown, examine the farmer's accounts, and calculate what the land is actually worth in real time.
Which just sounds like basic governance.
It is. Hastings argued that you cannot base the financial future of a state on abstract theories. You have to do the grueling math.
Imagine your city trying to assess your property taxes today without ever actually looking at your house, just guessing based on a 50-year-old ledger. It would be total chaos. Why on earth would Francis oppose gathering basic facts?
Well, Francis opposed it, theoretically, because he believed a fixed permanent tax was the only way to stimulate the economy. And he thought such a minute valuation was impossible to achieve accurately anyway.
But there was more to it than just theory, wasn't there?
Definitely. We have to look at the darker, much more calculated political motive underneath his theories. Francis was brilliantly manipulating public opinion back in London. Specifically, he was targeting the Whig Party.
And I'm assuming the Whig Party had a particular soft spot for the kind of policies Francis was pushing.
Absolutely. The Whig Party's entire political philosophy in 18th century England was rooted in the power and rights of the landed aristocracy. They saw strong, independent landowners as the ultimate check against the absolute power of the king.
Ah, so Francis knows his audience.
He knows them perfectly. So he packages his argument exactly for them. He paints the zamindars as oppressed landed gentry who are being, quote, crushed out of existence by Hastings' overbearing government.
Man, that is incredibly cynical. He's taking a complex Indian reality and translating it into the exact political buzzwords that will trigger outrage in a London parliament.
It worked, though. The sources note that Francis was a master at creating a highly polished narrative. He prioritized scoring political points in London over accurate governance in Bengal.
Just playing the PR game.
Yeah, he essentially tells the politicians back home, Hastings is a tyrant destroying the ancient nobility of India, completely ignoring the reality that these men were historically tax farmers, not noble lords.
So you have Hastings begging to look at a spreadsheet, basically, and Francis writing impassioned letters about fake oppression to his political buddies. How does the government even move forward when the two people in charge are operating in entirely different realities?
Hastings forces the issue through sheer executive willpower. In 1776, he pushed through the creation of the Amini Commission.
Okay, so he gets his investigation.
He does. Its sole purpose was to execute that hustabud, to send agents into the districts, make elaborate inquiries into the value of the lands, and crucially, to protect the ryots, the peasant cultivators.
And this is a vital point for you to understand, listener. Hastings isn't just trying to squeeze the rich zamindars for more tax money. He's actively trying to protect the people at the very bottom of the ladder who are actually farming the dirt.
Right. Hastings wanted to ensure the ryots had secure, official leases called patahs. These documents would explicitly outline what the peasant owed, guarding them against arbitrary taxation by the zamindars.
So they couldn't just be shaken down.
Exactly. Hastings knew that if you just handed absolute power to these zamindars, as Francis wanted, the peasants would be ruthlessly exploited because there would be absolutely no legal mechanism to stop it.
There is a really fascinating detail in the sources about how Hastings justifies this to his critics. He doesn't just rely on moral arguments, he brings hard economic data to the table regarding inflation.
Yes, the economic arguments Hastings makes are strikingly modern. He looks at historical inflation data to prove that locking in an old tax rate would bankrupt the government.
He's doing historical data analysis in the 1770s.
Exactly. He points out that during the time of a former ruler named Sujat Khan, the price of coarse rice, which was the primary consumption of the people, was 5.5 times cheaper than it was in 1776.
He's essentially using a consumer price index. He's saying that because rice costs 5 times more, the actual value of silver has plummeted.
He argues that the underlying economic reality has shifted. You can't just look at old tax records and say, well, they paid this much 50 years ago, so they should pay the exact same today.
That makes perfect sense.
Right, because if the value of money has drastically decreased, revenues have to adjust accordingly. Otherwise, the state cannot fund its own defense or basic administration.
That is an incredibly sophisticated macroeconomic argument for the time. Francis must have struggled to rebut hard inflation data like that.
Well, Francis responds by basically sticking his fingers in his ears.
Oh, of course.
He violently opposes the data collection. He dismisses the inflation argument as impossible to accurately calculate and falls back entirely on his pure laissez-faire ideology. He argued that the government should simply leave the zamindars completely alone.
But if the government steps back entirely, who protects the riots? Did Francis really believe these newly minted landlords would just automatically act like enlightened, benevolent gentlemen? It sounds like he's arguing for a colonial version of trickle-down benevolence.
That is his exact argument. Francis claimed it was in the natural long-term economic interest of the zamindar to conciliate the cultivators.
Because keeping them happy keeps the farms running.
That was his theory. He believed that if you made the zamindar secure in his property, he would logically realize he needed to treat the peasants well to keep them working the land.
But I mean, the fatal flaw in trickle-down benevolence is the assumption that human beings always act rationally and in their long-term best interests, which history proves they rarely do.
Very rarely. And Hastings gives Francis a blistering reality check on that exact point. The sources contain a fantastic rebuttal where Hastings points out that this presumed mutual interest is a theory that might sound elegant in a Parisian salon, but completely fails in reality.
What did he actually say?
Hastings bluntly states that many of the zamindars were utterly incapable of judging for themselves what their long-term interests were. He literally describes them in the official record as being of weak understanding or even absolute idiots.
Putting absolute idiots in the official governmental record just shows how completely exhausted Hastings was with Francis's naivete.
He really was. Because Hastings knew the territory. Experience showed that instead of improving the land, these men often just outsourced the tax collection to even more ruthless middlemen.
Squeezing the peasants for every penny.
Exactly, to pay their own debts or fund their lavish lifestyles. Without direct government intervention, without those official leases to secure the riots, the agricultural backbone of the country would collapse.
So we have this immense clash. The pragmatist, armed with inflation tables, demanding an on-the-ground assessment, versus the theorist armed with French economic philosophy and powerful political connections in London. Knowing how history usually plays out, I have a sinking feeling about who wins this debate.
You're right to feel that way. The theorist wins. Back in England, the court of directors eventually sided with Philip Francis.
Naturally, they didn't want to do the work.
They hated the idea of doing deep local investigations. They found it too disruptive, too expensive, and frankly, it alarmed the native landholders who were writing letters complaining to anyone who would listen in London.
So they just shut it down.
Yes, the directors actively discouraged the minute examinations into the actual value of the lands.
They actively chose ignorance. They decided it was better not to know what the land was worth, just to avoid the political headache of measuring it.
And that decision set the stage for a massive historical error. A few years later, under Lord Cornwallis, Francis's ideas fully took root, leading to the famous Permanent Settlement of 1793.
Where they locked everything in.
Yeah, the government locked in the land revenues in perpetuity and essentially recognized the zamindars as the absolute proprietors of the soil, exactly as Francis had dreamed.
And what was the fallout of that decision? How does the 1812 report look back on the permanent settlement?
The report views it as a policy based on a total misunderstanding of Indian landholding. By ignoring the messy data and forcing a foreign framework onto the country, they stripped away the traditional protections of the cultivators.
Just wiped out centuries of customary rights.
Exactly. It popularized a view of India and England that was hopelessly at contradiction with the facts of history, and it permanently altered the social and economic fabric of Bengal.
It's just wild. A guy reads some imported economic theory, decides it must apply everywhere uniformly, plays the political game back home, and ends up accidentally reshaping the lives of millions of people for generations.
It really distills the core lesson of this entire deep dive. There's immense danger in trying to solve complex, localized problems with distant theoretical solutions.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale.
It is. When a plan sounds perfect and elegant on paper, but completely ignores the messy, contradictory on-the-ground data, when you mistake the map for the territory, it almost always ends in disaster.
It makes you look at modern institutions differently, doesn't it? We've been unpacking the 1700s, but consider how often modern governments, massive tech conglomerates or global NGOs, operate exactly like Philip Francis today.
Oh, all the time.
How often do executives or policymakers force an elegant, imported theory onto a complex local reality simply because they are too impatient or too proud to do the hard work of measuring the actual ground beneath their feet? It leaves you wondering, if we were to send an armed posse of reality checkers into the headquarters of our modern institutions to see who is actually looking at the data, what kind of standoff would we be looking at today?